So first off, I'd like to welcome everyone. We have a really strong participation in this call, so clearly the issue of PFAS-contaminated drinking water is of concern to many people throughout Alaska and across the nation. Welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference. We're pleased to be joined today by David Andrews of Environmental Working Group and Shana Casper of Toxics Action Center. Our teleconference is titled PFAS-Contaminated Drinking Water in the United States, a look at the extent of contamination, the failure of the EPA, and the success of community action. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. And again, there are two presentations for this call. Links were included in the email that I sent this morning, or you can find them on our homepage at akaction.org. The email I sent also includes links to a number of recent articles related to contamination in Parchment, Michigan and Fairbanks, Alaska. During the last 10 minutes of the call, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions or make comments. And just by way of introduction, I wanted to just mention that the problem of PFAS-contaminated drinking water is all over the news this week, with the drinking water in Parchment, Michigan determined to be unsafe due to contamination levels at 20 times the EPA advisory level, which you'll learn is not set in the right place to begin with. The issue has also been very much on the minds of Alaskans since the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation sampling revealed unsafe levels of the chemicals in drinking water in the Fairbanks area. And you'll be hearing more about what is going on in Fairbanks from ACAT's director, Pam Miller, towards the end of the call. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest presenters for today. David Andrews is Senior Scientist at Environmental Working Group. David's work focuses on finding ways to change national environmental regulations and government policies to protect public health. During his 5 years at Environmental Working Group, he has developed comprehensive knowledge of the regulatory processes affecting industrial chemicals, consumer products, cosmetics, and nanomaterials. David has conducted more than 100 media interviews on various public health issues and frequently deals with federal agencies and legislative offices. He holds a PhD in chemistry from Northwestern. We're very honored to have you, David. I'm going to go ahead and also introduce Shana Casper, who will be presenting second. Shana is with the Toxics Action Center, where she serves as Vermont State Director and Community Organizer in New Hampshire. Shana works out of the Montpelier office to assist local community groups to clean up hazardous waste sites and promote clean water, safe energy, and zero waste. Her organizing experience includes College Zero Waste, fossil fuel divestment and housing justice work, and the Join for Justice Fellowship. Shana grew up in Vermont and is a graduate of the United World College in New Mexico and holds a BA in Environmental Studies and Political Science from Macalester College in Minnesota, where she focused on water and sanitation. So again, welcome to both of you. And David, would you like to go ahead and begin?
Absolutely. Thank you, Diana. And pleasure to be speaking today. Obviously, this is a topic that's very pertinent across the country and it's getting
David,
incredible.
I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you, and I'm not sure that I'm the only one. Can you try speaking up?
Sure. Can you hear me now? How does that sound?
Yes. Oh, yes. Much better.
Great. So this is obviously a topic of incredible importance now, especially as we see the really incredible attention being paid to this class of chemicals, due in large part to really our expanding knowledge of the extent of contamination across the country. And so I'm just going to give really a short overview that scratches some of the surface on the background of these contaminants, why this is such an issue, how widespread the contamination is, and then also touch a little bit on the health effects. As I said, this is really just scratching the surface, and I've also included a few additional resources at the end of the PowerPoint, a number of which were emailed out earlier. And so on slide 2 is really this overview of really talking about this poison's legacy, DuPont, 3M, and then going into the drinking water crisis, and also some discussion of the recent ATSDR draft toxicological profile and why that was such a big deal and why it became national news. So on slide 3, I have a picture. This is a picture of Rob Bilott, a defense attorney that filed suit against DuPont. And this is really what initiated Environmental Working Group's effort in this space. And this was in 2001, 2002. And through discovery of that case and publication of all of those discovery documents, we learned that DuPont knew about the potential impacts of PFOA and PFOA exposure. And they knew much more than they told the public. They knew much more than they told the EPA. And they'd known this for decades, going back to the 70s, that these chemicals were extremely persistent and that once they are released into the environment, they don't break down. They are bioaccumulative and that when you're exposed to them, your levels continue to increase. And this is because they have a half-life of many of these of 4 years or longer in people. And so if you're exposed today and you're no longer exposed in 4 years, on average, you'll still have half of that initial amount. So they really tend to build up in our bodies and in our blood. And as I said, it's through discovery that all of these documents from DuPont were made public, and we really started digging into the issue. Likewise, in one of the settlement agreements that he negotiated with DuPont, it initiated a study of the Mid-Ohio River Valley and close to 70,000 residents who had been consuming some of this contaminated water from the DuPont facility there. And it's through that study that we actually know a significant amount about the potential health effects, and I think it had an incredible role in focusing scientific research on these chemicals and drawing greater attention to them in general. And I think was really critical in moving this issue forward and ultimately some of the information that we're seeing now and the efforts we're seeing now to really both understand the extent of contamination as well as hold these companies responsible for their pollution. On slide 4, this is an example of a document that we actually have blown up in our office in Washington, D.C. It is the results of, and I apologize, it's a little blurry, but it's the results of biomonitoring pregnant women in their cord blood of their infants, and the correlation in a number of cases with birth defects. And these were women who were working in the facility and had higher levels of these chemicals in their blood. This is an example of a document that DuPont had that they did not bother to share with EPA, which is required under federal law. It did not become public until this court case. Slide 5 is one of our initial efforts it's the Chemical Industry Archives is a website we put together that actually made all of the court discovery documents accessible to the public. And so really trying to make this information available to reporters and concerned citizens across the United States and really across the globe, and really trying to bring more attention to all of these studies that DuPont had completed at the time. Slide 6 is going back to that document I showed earlier about the birth defects in children. And it was a petition filed by Environmental Working Group as well as by Rob Bilott to EPA requesting that they take action against DuPont for failing to submit these health studies to the EPA as required. And this actually led to the largest fine at the time under the Toxic Substances Control Act of $16.5 million. It really seems to be a drop in the bucket, but significant in that it really at least drew attention to the fact that this company had been doing testing on workers and not following federal regulations in terms of making that available. So it really shone an incredibly negative spotlight on DuPont. Although I would argue it would be nice to see a fine that is hundreds of thousands of times larger. Slide 7 is also some of the work that that DuPont had done in using these chemicals in numerous other applications outside of the ones that we hear about most often today, which would be the firefighting foam and the contamination there, and Teflon. But also these found incredible use in everything from the coatings on your outdoor tools, your clothing, your fast food wrappers, and that's a place potentially for further discussion at another time, but a place where we've also done some research and been very active. And in this case, we were highlighting the work of an internal DuPont employee who raised concerns that the company was really trying to skirt FDA regulations and use much higher concentrations of these chemicals than was allowed by the agency, and that they were leaching into food. Slide 8 is actually a headline from May 2000, when 3M announced that, as a good corporate citizen, that they were going to stop producing Scotchgard chemicals in particular. This is PFOS, because it's the right thing to do. It's good for the environment, and noted that they were doing this, but taking a $200 million hit to the bottom line that year. The headline 2 days later in the New York Times was actually a revision, in that the EPA reached out to the New York Times and actually reported and informed them that actually they really forced 3M's hand because of significant concerns about the potential harm that these chemicals could be causing to people and the environment. So it's just an interesting look at the framing, and I think in the context of the 3M story, a really pertinent article came out yesterday by Sharon Lerner, who really dug into the history of 3M and how they knew and had significant information in the 70s about the impacts that are now coming to attention publicly, including the ability of these chemicals to impact the immune system, impact cholesterol levels, stuff that the company really managed to bury for 4 decades and keep out of the public eye and keep out of scrutiny. And so really incredible piece looking at that, and references some of 3M's internal publication strategy, really, to craft peer-reviewed publications that are credible, understandable, and demonstrate that no product that 3M has ever made could be attributed or cause any adverse health effects. Really, really concerning in how these companies have hidden studies that indicate harm, kept them from the public, and really led us to the place that we are now, where we have incredible widespread contamination and are only at this point really starting to understand how potent these chemicals are at incredibly low concentrations, and the impacts they are likely having on the population currently. So slide 9 is just a quick overview of some of the Teflon trademarks, and this is something I pulled a year or two ago, really just trying to see how widespread this was. And this is just for Teflon and the use of their trademark, but includes an incredible range of products, from coatings, paints, your car wash, irons. Really, it seems like nearly anything you could put in your house, your car, your built environment can be coated with these chemicals. It's really just an indication of how widespread they are. And so switching gears on slide 10 is the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so really trying to look at the picture with drinking water contamination. And I'll start in 1996, there were significant amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act. And these, in part, this initiated the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, and this is a program that can test for no more than 30 contaminants every 5 years. Through this Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, or the UCMR, is how, actually starting in 2015, we really got any information on how widespread these chemicals were in drinking water. Up until that time, there had been no national testing or survey of prevalence of these contaminants. And then under this program, the EPA is supposed to use that data to make a determination whether or not to regulate a contaminant. There were two major problems with this testing for PFAS chemicals. One was that they only tested for 6 of the chemicals, including PFOA and PFOS. But the scientific method for essentially the same test could have detected 17 chemicals, and that's part of the statutory language that was drafted into the Safe Drinking Water Act and this UCMR rule in this limit of 30 chemicals. And so even though this information could be easily gathered scientifically, it was dropped because of the way the legislation was crafted. The other issue is that the EPA has a methodology for setting a reporting limit. And it turns out that most labs that did the testing could detect contamination an order of magnitude lower than what was required to be reported to the agency. So in many cases, there's significant contamination that at levels just below the limits. And those reporting limits were 40 parts per trillion for PFOS and 20 parts per trillion for PFOA. And I'll get into a little more detail about that in a minute. I think one of the important takeaways, though, from looking at the Safe Drinking Water Act and doing a lot of work recently on drinking water contamination across the U.S. is that the takeaway for me is that no new regulations have been set for an unregulated contaminant in over 2 decades. And so it seems very unlikely that the federal government will take a leadership role in setting drinking water standards for the perfluorinated chemicals, for these PFAS chemicals, or anything else for that matter. The process has become so convoluted that it's not clear that any contaminant can make it through. So it's really quite concerning, and I think it points to a bigger failure of our country to adequately regulate drinking water contaminants and put in the resources necessary to ensure that we have safe and clean drinking water for all Americans. So switching to slide 11, these are a few maps that were based on this unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. We initially published a map in 2015, and that had essentially the first half of the results from the testing program that went on. The testing was primarily collected in 2014 and 2015. Then I was later involved in a peer-reviewed publication with academic researchers, really trying to correlate the findings of this nationwide sampling with contamination sites. And this would be looking at the correlation with industrial sites, airports, wastewater treatment facilities. And so there was a correlation. The more of industrial sites, the more airports nearby, the greater the likelihood of having these PFAS chemicals in your water. But the results were really unsatisfying in the ability to directly identify the sources of contamination. And it really pointed to, and this is for a number of technical reasons in terms of the granularity of the EPA data, but post 9/11, you can't get public information on where exactly the wells are and where the water is coming from, making it much more difficult to identify where the source of the contamination is. And so it became much more of a local issue and not really possible on a national scale to identify the direct sources of contamination. Slide 12 is is just an overview of a map that we have been publishing in collaboration with Northeastern University. And this map pulls together our previous versions that include all the EPA water testing data, but it also includes all of the information that Northeastern University has collected on contaminated communities across the country, and links to news stories that they've pulled together, and gives a much broader look at the contamination and what we know now. And slide 13 is actually the updated version. This is last updated actually just 1 or 2 days ago, to include all the information that's come out in the last few months with respect to Michigan, a few other states that have been actively looking for these PFAS contaminated sites, as well as the Department of Defense testing at military bases. And so those sites are also identified on this map. And then moving on to slide 14, I think is a slide that should really stand out. And this is a look at the frequency of detection for the PFAS contaminants in the UCMR 3 program. And this is the first column shows that out of just under 40,000 samples, chemicals such as PFOA and PFOS were found approximately 1% of the time. And then chemicals like PFNA, PFBS were found approximately 0.1% of the time. So 1 out of every 1,000 water samples. And then this testing lab ran approximately 1/3 of the nationwide samples. And what they found is that if they had looked at slightly lower concentrations, and so instead of using just the EPA reporting limit, but if they'd looked down to 5 parts per trillion or 5 nanograms a liter or 2.5 nanograms a liter, the number of results or detects increased an incredible amount. So if you looked at PFOA down to 2.5 parts per trillion, they had nearly a quarter of their samples had detectable PFOA. Likewise, for a contaminant like PFBS, where it was less than 0.1% of the nationwide sampling, when they looked down to a lower concentration, it was over 1 in every 10 samples had contamination. So it's really incredible that I think we'll see significantly more contaminated sites across the country, and in many ways, these sites will be indicative of upstream pollution. And so having this information will greatly aid in identifying the sources of contamination and ultimately cleaning up those sources. I will say that none of this information is public. It's all held by this private lab. And as far as we know, we could not come up with a way to compel them to make it public. And they specifically stated that it's proprietary information. It wasn't required by EPA. And in most cases, most of the water utilities did not even know if they had detects below the EPA reporting limit. So moving on to slide 15, we actually use that data to estimate that very likely over 100 million Americans are served water that has these PFAS contaminants, PFOA, PFOS, or these other ones at over the detection limit. So they're likely in water just slightly below the levels that EPA required reporting. And this is another headline from 2 days ago that the state of Michigan has identified potentially 11,000 different sites. And this includes manufacturing facilities, car washes, electroplating facilities, airports, that have the potential to have released these contaminants into the groundwater and into the environment. So really, the scope of the problem really just seems to be expanding exponentially. Now I'm going to quickly touch on the health effects. I mentioned earlier the study in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and the surrounding community. That led to 3 independent scientists reviewing all of the health data for the community and also all of the biomonitoring data, so their blood lead levels for PFOA. And what they found and published in dozens of scientific studies were probable link reports. So whether or not this health outcome was probably linked to the PFOA exposure in their drinking water. And they found a probable link with high cholesterol, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancer, pregnancy-induced hypertension. And so this is the first big epidemiological study or study of human health outcomes from exposure to PFOA. Slide 17 highlights a few of the more recent concerns and concerns that are also coming up in human studies, including impacts on the immune system, birth weight, time to pregnancy, weight gain, and then endocrine disruption. And some of these are animal studies that they're looking at mammary gland development issues. So really an incredible range, and I don't think I've covered all of them at all, but really just an indication of how many potential health endpoints these chemicals may be impacting in an incredibly low concentration. Slide 18 is just a quick overview of, is there a safe level of exposure? This is really just looking at this downward trend of where even the EPA has been in the past decade. In terms of 2009, they had a provisional health advisory of 400 parts per trillion. Their draft was 100. The health advisory currently is 70 parts per trillion for both PFOA and PFAS combined. And then some of the recent studies, such as the work done by Philippe Grandjean, is based on immunotoxicity or mammary gland development. A safe level of exposure may be less than 1 part per trillion in drinking water. And then down at the bottom, I've got a piece we put out 2 years ago indicating that if you use that same data and knowing that we are already exposed through food, dust, our environment, there really is no safe level of exposure in drinking water. And so slide 19 is the draft. It was an internal email from the White House DPA discussing a draft report from ATSDR. And that report indicated that a safe exposure level was essentially 10 times lower than the value that EPA had calculated when they set the health advisory limit of 70 parts per trillion. And so they were worried that this was going to be a public relations nightmare. It is. I think the nightmare, though, really is for the people who are consuming water that's contaminated with these chemicals. And so the takeaway here really is that the more we learn about these chemicals, the more we study human health impacts of them, the more we find out that they can be potent and impacting health at incredibly low concentrations. And so slide 20 is actually the quote taken from the bottom of a 1,000-page document from New Jersey when they drafted a drinking water limit for PFOA. And they highlight that because these chemicals may be having impacts at such low concentrations, any additional exposure from drinking water may potentially pose some risk of health effects. And so any additional exposure could be causing harm. And so with that, the last page is resources. That was really a quick overview, but thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And I did want to mention that the Sharon Lerner piece about 3M that David mentioned is available. There is a link to that also in the email that I sent around this morning. Definitely worth checking out. Again, we will have opportunity for questions and comments towards the end of the call. But for now, I'd like to go ahead and invite Shana to go ahead and begin with her presentation.
Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Shana Casper. I'm the Vermont and New Hampshire State Director with Toxics Action Center. And I work with a dozen communities fighting PFAS drinking water contamination in their neighborhoods, and I've been working as the facilitator for the National PFAS Contamination Coalition for the past year. So over the next 20 minutes, I'll be going over why and how we formed this coalition, our accomplishments so far, and what we're working on moving forward. So just to begin things off, 30 years ago, Toxics Action Center was created to provide assistance, support, and guidance to residents struggling to protect their homes and families from pollution. And the high-profile tragedy in Woburn, Massachusetts, made famous by the book and movie A Civil Action, led environmental groups to realize that to prevent environmental health threats, we need knowledge and experts, but mostly we need political power. And so we were founded to help families across New England facing their own Woburn-like situations. And really nowhere do we see this more than with families fighting PFAS drinking water contamination. As David, said, no one should have to worry that if the water coming out of their taps is safe to drink. Yet communities across the country are learning that their water is contaminated with PFAS, the toxic Teflon chemical linked to kidney disorders and cancers and more. And as David said, decades of intentional concealment and deceit by some of the most powerful global corporations and a complicit federal government has led to a lack of a strong policy on these poisons in everyday products and in drinking water. And this has really led to many residents being confused and concerned. And so as I shared in the 2016 CHE webinar as well, I first found out about this contamination in Bennington, Vermont, where I was working as a community organizer with Toxics Action Center. So I drove down to Bennington, where a firehouse was stuffed to the brim with concerned and sick families. People were scared. The water that was coming out of their taps that looked and smelled and tasted fine, they were now being told that it was a chemical that they never heard of was poisoning them and likely had been for years. But so thankfully, Vermont really set the gold standard for a strong state response to finding out that their residents were being poisoned by these Teflon toxins. So, that night in February of 2016, they drew a 1.5-mile radius around the potentially responsible party, a former fabric coating factory, and they put everyone on bottled water delivery, quickly went out and got everyone's drinking water tested, got point of entry treatment system installed, got blood tests for concerned residents, and they stood strong when Saint-Gobain sued the state due to health protective 20 part per trillion standard for the state response. So for slide 2, as I was working with folks in Bennington, I was finding out that this was not a unique incident in my region. The Saint-Gobain factory that had closed down in 2002 in Vermont had simply reopened in New Hampshire, and tens of thousands of people there had been exposed to these toxic chemicals as well. Right over the border in Hoosick Falls, New York, it was the same story. And in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, moms formed a group called Testing for Peas. And in Westfield, Massachusetts, there's Westfield residents advocating for themselves, or RAFT. And in Green Cape, they were fighting contamination from firefighting foam. And so within just a few months, I was working with 8 communities in 4 states in the region, and then was starting to get calls from folks across the country in Michigan and Colorado, Washington, you name it. They were all facing PFAS drinking water contamination. So the next slide here is from our conference. So at Toxics Action Center, we provide side-by-side community organizing assistance, strategic advice, and leadership training for grassroots groups, and a network of experts and a network of community activists. So while many communities are facing a similar problem, one of our strategies that we do is to bring them together to share strategies and to join forces to push for change. So we joined with Silent Spring Institute and the community group Testing for Peas and Northeastern University's Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute that does a lot of work with EWG as well. And we organized a conference in June of 2017, so last summer, to have community groups meet each other, get the most up-to-date scientific research, legal decisions, policy, and more. So more than 30 community group leaders from 13 communities across the country attended the conference, along with government regulators, scientists, attorneys, public health professionals, advocates, you name it. And at the conference, we facilitated 2 strategy sessions just for impacted community group leaders. We knew from experience that these groups had so much to learn from one another, more than they could learn from scientists and experts sometimes. So we got them together to share their stories and experiences of what works to get a government response, what doesn't, and what even to ask for, what was possible. And to share hope. Oftentimes, I'm sure as Pam can say, doing this work can be incredibly lonely for these community groups. And we came out of these sessions with a call to do more together, to form a coalition of community groups fighting PFAS drinking water contamination in their communities. So we formed the National PFAS Contamination Coalition in order to better support local organizing for clean water and health protection by better sharing information and data and facts and connecting folks to experts and to build a bigger movement of national change on these issues by working on state and national campaigns together for solutions and to build a collaborative and powerful force to take on big polluters. So now I'm on to slide 4 here. The coalition has 5 main platform planks that impacted community groups sign on to. So one is medical monitoring, so to be proactive in the early detection and identification of PFAS-related health problems by providing scientific guidelines to healthcare providers and funding for access for all community groups that are impacted, so folks can have the health education information that they need. Secondly, we called for getting a comprehensive national health study to examine the impacts of PFAS exposure within multiple cohorts over time. Third, a science-based 1 part per trillion national enforceable drinking water standard for infants, children, most vulnerable populations, and for combined total for all PFAS. Fourth, to support state-level change for lower drinking water standards and air emission regulations to focus on protecting our natural resources to prevent this contamination in the first place. And finally, to make polluters pay. We know polluters must be held accountable financially for their contamination, especially in this most egregious examples where polluters have deceived local communities, regulatory agencies, and their shareholders in order to continue their abusive practices. So while these are the collaborative campaign efforts, they're by no means an exhaustive list of all of the campaigns in which these community group representatives are campaigning. Community groups across the country are fighting their own local campaigns to stop PFAS exposure, clean up sites, and be compensated for damages, including fighting for drinking water filters, new drinking water well sites, passing health protection policies, stopping future exposures by closing down factories or voluntary phase out, changing mil spec requirements to require these chemicals and that these mil spec require chemicals in firefighting foam. Getting good cleanup plans for contaminated sites, and just so much more at the local, state, and federal level. And these cleanup plans are just the tip of the iceberg of what the coalition is really working on. So on the next slide, we focused our initial efforts on passing a national health study, and as I'm sure you all saw, we won a $10 million funding package through the National Defense Spending Bill last year to do a health study in 4 communities impacted by Department of Defense contamination. We know that is not enough. EWG is saying that an estimated 110 million people are living in the U.S. are being poisoned with this contamination. But this is a significant victory nonetheless that will add to the large and growing body of knowledge that these chemicals are poison and that they have a real and incredibly significant impact on human health. Other community groups have taken the health study effort into their own hands. So many living in the shadow of the St. Gobain plant in Merrimack, New Hampshire, are concerned that their water and air have been poisoning them for decades. And many municipal water sources have tested positive for PFAS, and several above the Vermont standard of 20 parts per trillion or New Jersey's 13, because New Hampshire has a weaker standard of the federal 70 parts per trillion. So the community group Merrimack Citizens for Clean Water formed to address this concern. And over the past year now, Toxics Action Center has provided extensive leadership coaching, and we helped this group to develop a community-based health survey, working side by side with community group leaders to go door to door last summer and fall, collecting more than 500 surveys of residents in the area, and then supporting the group to analyze this data by engaging with our network of environmental health experts. And academic partners are now working on getting the troubling, community-based health study results published. And the group is continuing to push for more testing and more cleanup. And this is just one story of, how community groups across the country are fighting back. So then on slide 6, the coalition is now focused on getting a national enforceable drinking water standard that's science-based and health protective for the most vulnerable populations. So based on recent scientific studies and in consultation with academic and advocacy partners, the coalition decided to adopt an ask of 1 part per trillion maximum contaminant load, MCL, for a combined total of the family of PFAS chemicals. And immediately before the National EPA Leadership Summit in May, as David said, it was leaked that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, had hidden this release of a study that said PFAS chemicals were 10 times more toxic than had previously been estimated. And so leading up to and following the National Summit, we helped the coalition organize for a seat at the table for impacted communities and in support for releasing the report. And so after repeatedly requesting representation to the event at the local and the state and the federal level, and repeatedly being told no, we helped the coalition to organize a national day of action to demand a seat at the table, taking pictures of their water and their kitchen table and demanding representation at the summit. And the campaign escalation culminated in a webinar that Toxics Action Center organized with the director of the ATSDR, Dr. Bricey, for an hour and a half answering questions for the coalition. The report was released a week later, showing that the federal and state PFAS levels were not nearly protective enough of human health. And then following that, there have been, local protests, and in the following weeks, several states have released more health protective standards. And as you can see on the next slide, in a small way, we did win a seat at the table. 4 days before the summit and the action, one of the community group leaders, Andrea Miko, got a call from Region 1 Administrator Dunn inviting her to the event. So Andrea flew down to DC on this short notice to meet face-to-face with Administrator Pruitt and to deliver the coalition's demand and attend the summit as a representative from the coalition. And the event and the action led to extensive media attention, including the Washington Post and CNN, and the first article on PFAS in Popular Science, and lots more. And then following the national summit, we secured a commitment from EPA that there would be regional summits to be co-created and co-hosted by impacted communities. And then with, facing some political resistance, we were able to get the EPA to deliver on that commitment. The results so far have been a powerful event in Exeter, New Hampshire, June 25th and 26th, attended by more than 200 New Englanders, where nearly 50 citizen leaders told their personal stories, including representatives from all of the community groups in the region. And these groups showed strength and resilience, and their stories were really picked up and shared by many local media outlets. And Region 3 just had their event in Horsham, Pennsylvania, and Region 8 in Fountain Valley, Colorado is having their summit a week from today. So it's really a major victory to get representation for impacted communities, to have their voices heard. But especially, as we know under this administration, it's not enough to simply that's not enough to secure the change that we need. And the EPA has committed to a national PFAS management plan this fall. And they know now that thousands of impacted and poisoned and pissed off parents are watching and waiting and are ready to escalate should these hearings and meetings just be an exercise of public engagement and have been months of wasted time and energy. So participating in the coalition and organizing within their communities have inspired, at least 2 people to run for Congress, have made PFAS a dinner table conversation in communities across the country. And We're Guessing has also employed, several DuPont and 3M lawyers full time. I've been facilitating this coalition for just over a year now, and I've never seen more committed and determined and collaborative and powerful and hungry activism in my life. So then on the last slide, just real quickly of just summarizing and how folks can help. In the year since the National PFAS Contamination Coalition's launch, they have done so much. At the state level, Vermont has set a 20 part per trillion standard for a total of 5 PFASs. Michigan is testing all of their state's water. Washington banned PFAS and firefighting foam, and so much more. They've gotten funding to do a multi-site health study through Congress. They've elevated the issue to national importance, looping in other groups that are fighting PFAS drinking water contamination from across the country. The coalition has grown to now being community group member leaders from 18 community groups, representing 11 states and Guam. And they've sparked an international movement as well, where the Coalition Against PFAS, CAP, is an Australian model of modeling of the U.S. coalition, and have been mentoring and connecting with groups fighting drinking water contamination in Italy and the Netherlands as well. But mostly, they are literally saving lives in their communities, by speaking up to powerful polluters, not backing down to government officials that are too slow to do the right thing. They're finding the poisoned water, stopping their community's exposure, and fighting for their community's health. So if you know of a community group that should be a part of this coalition, you send them to pfasproject.net/join to have them fill out kind of the application to join the coalition. And then there's other ways to help the coalition as well. And so I have my contact information there to find out how to be a scientific or advocacy advisor to the coalition, to financially support, or any other way that you could possibly help. So that's just a little bit about the coalition and how we formed, what we've accomplished so far, and what we're focusing on for the next couple of months.
Thank you so much, Shana, for sharing what's going on, what people are doing at the grassroots level, and for bringing us these exciting community success stories. Very inspiring, and I always like to end calls on a positive "what can you do" note. So thank you for your contribution to that. Now, just before we do our questions and discussion time, I'd like to invite Pam Miller, Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, to give us an update on the PFAS contamination situation in Fairbanks, Alaska.
Thank you, Diana, and also David and Shane. I just want to express my deep appreciation for sharing your knowledge and experience today. I just very much appreciate it. Thank you. So this is just a quick update, what we know about what's happening in Fairbanks. As we now know, many Fairbanks area residents are affected by contamination of their drinking water caused by the dispersion of aqueous firefighting foams in groundwater plumes from at least 4 sites: Eielson Air Force Base, the Regional Fire Training Center, the Fairbanks International Airport, as well as Fort Wainwright. And we believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg, not only for the Fairbanks area, but for Alaska, recognizing the sheer number of military and airport facilities that we have in this state. And I'd like to acknowledge the local Water Wake Up Alaskans to the Toxic Environmental Reality and the work of David Barry and Nana Paldi in organizing citizens in Fairbanks to take action on these very serious public health issues. In 2016, the state of Alaska established cleanup levels for PFOA and PFAS in soil and groundwater at 400 parts per trillion for each substance. The Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation's technical memorandum states, although not yet adopted into regulation, new language allows the department to consider an EPA health advisory, that's 70 parts per trillion, in setting a cleanup level on a site-specific basis. So as we've heard from both David and Shana, 70 parts per trillion is many times what we know based on scientific evidence, the health endpoints that occur at such extremely low levels. And I think it's fair to say that the state of Alaska is mired in inaction. Shana mentioned that the federal government is complicit, and the state of Alaska is basically stating that they're waiting for the federal government to take action. And I think this is especially egregious based on what we know now concerning the science of the health effects of these chemicals. So the state has not established an enforceable health protective standard for drinking water, although the state has both the authority and the duty to protect the drinking water of all of its citizens. So Water, as well as Alaska Community Action on Toxics, have specifically requested the following from the state of Alaska: to set statewide health protective maximum enforceable contaminant levels in drinking water. And we agree with the PFAS Coalition, of which we are a part, really at 1 part per trillion for the combined total of the PFAS chemicals. We want to ensure that those responsible for the pollution of drinking water sources provide safe drinking water for all households whose water sources exceed this 1 part per trillion level. We want to have the state institute a community-advised biomonitoring program to assess the levels of PFAS in blood serum of people affected or likely to be affected by the drinking water contamination. And we want health screening and medical monitoring of people within the affected communities. We also want to institute a comprehensive groundwater monitoring program to assess the full extent of PFAS contamination in Fairbanks, as well as possible PFAS-contaminated areas around the state. And finally, requiring stringent and health protective cleanup of contaminated areas and remediation of groundwater according to best available technologies and standards, and ensuring and preventing harm by prohibiting the use of PFAS firefighting foams for training purposes and requiring replacement of these PFAS chemicals with safe, non-fluorinated alternatives. I think it's fair to say that other states are leading the way on PFAS, and we're calling upon Alaskan politicians to protect the health of Alaskans. And right now, as I mentioned, the state is just mired in inaction, waiting for action on the federal level, which is not happening anytime soon. And so we are making a new call upon our state legislature to pass laws similar to the one in the state of Washington, which is banning the use of fluorinated foams. And then I also just wanted to mention some work that we're doing on an international level to achieve international bans on several of the PFAS chemicals through the Stockholm Convention. And that's a global legally binding treaty of 182 nations that have come together to rid the world of the world's most dangerous chemicals. So in addition to the contamination of drinking water that we're finding all over the country and really the world, we're also finding that these PFAS chemicals, because of their high persistence, are transported on ocean and wind currents into the Arctic, where they accumulate in the bodies of fish, wildlife, and people. In our own community-based studies, we're finding levels of these chemicals in the blood serum of people on St. Lawrence Island, for example, and also throughout the circumpolar Arctic. PFAS, was banned under the Stockholm Convention in 2009. However, there are several exemptions, and we're working very hard to close those loopholes to ban all uses of PFAS. PFOA was also nominated to the Stockholm Convention and is now in the final stage of review. And another PFAS chemical, PFHXS, was nominated by Norway just last year, and it's in the second stage of review and will be considered by the Scientific Expert Committee this September at their meeting in Rome. So we're working very hard to get these chemicals banned globally, because we have to affect the commerce of these chemicals that are not only transported throughout the world on wind and ocean currents, but through global chemical commerce. So I'll end my comments there and certainly welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. And yes, now we would like to invite questions and comments from those of you who have called in. So if you'd like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation. And we don't have a whole lot of time, so if you could be somewhat brief with your question, that would be helpful. And also to please mute your line after you're done, just so we don't end up with a lot of noise. So now is your opportunity to ask questions of any of our speakers or make comments. *2.
Yes, so this is Susan Newhausen from City of Hope. Those were great talks, very informative. I guess one of my questions, since California is sort of burning right now and they're using all these foam retardants, which I'm guessing are probably still the fluorinating compounds, what's the replacement and what's in those that's actually also going to be problematic? Do we know?
That's an excellent question. Does anyone want to take a... Yeah, is that David?
Yes, this
responding?
is David. Yes, that's an interesting question, and I'm actually unsure if there's PFAS, and maybe someone else knows, in the firefighting foams. I know it's particularly useful for putting out oil fires, but don't know about its use in wildfires. One thing that has come up is that most of the replacements in the U.S. for firefighting foams at airports and air bases are shorter chain PFAS chemicals that we're concerned aren't any better. And part of the reason for that is some of the military standards, and I know there's a number of groups that are working on getting that changed, because there are places such as Heathrow Airport that are not using any of these fluorinated chemicals, so they don't have the long-term potential health impacts. So there are some better alternatives, but some of the alternatives are similarly concerning and really from the same family.
This is Laura.
Thank you.
This is Laura Ola. I wanted to follow up on the question. If you Google Australia and non-fluorinated alternatives, Australia is way far ahead of us, and there are non-fluorinated alternatives.
Thank you.
My name is Oh, go ahead.
I have a question. Has anyone measured the level of these fluorinated compounds in the Anchorage drinking water system?
Pam, do you have a...
Yeah, as far as I know, there is not PFAS contamination in the Anchorage drinking water, primarily because our water comes from a lake that's upstream from the military facilities. But if anybody has any additional information, please let me know. And that's not to say that the groundwater on the bases, the J-Bear base, might not be contaminated. But as far as I know, the drinking water supply for Anchorage is not contaminated with PFAS.
Thank you.
Right, yeah. And to clarify, all the water utilities serving over 10,000 people were tested in the nationwide sampling. So I believe there were non-detects and they would be under the reporting limit. That's not to say that there's not lower level contamination, but that would be unknown.
Again, thank you.
Thank you. And there was someone else trying to ask a question.
Oh, yes. My name is Leslie Pacey. I have a nonprofit agency in Southern Alabama to research our cancer clusters here. My daughter's a cancer survivor, and I got involved in this about 10 years ago. Since then, I've been looking at our drinking water issues, and we do have some contamination issues that exceed health guidelines but are not over legal limits for certain contaminants. But, you know, with this being on everybody's radar right now, and we are so closely located near Pensacola, where the Escambia County Utilities has just filed its second lawsuit for PFAS contamination. Their water has these chemicals in it, and we are pretty darn close, like 40 minutes away from Pensacola. One of the sources of contamination is the Pensacola Naval Air Station using these firefighting, foams, and then the other source is a plant that makes these foams and injects them into the aquifer system. So my question to you is primarily, how concerned do I need to be in my community about this? How do I know that my water doesn't have this in it? And how do I go about finding that out as a community?
This is Shana. I can start, and David, I guess, definitely jump in where I leave off. I mean, I guess as we were saying before, anytime that I think we think that there might be PFAS drinking water contamination and we test for it, just about every time we find it, as I think we keep saying, that we are just scratching the surface as far as how extensive this contamination is. And because these chemicals are so toxic at such low levels, any amount is a significant concern to communities. So while we definitely know that the burden of finding the contamination areas should be on government officials and on polluters. So, first of all, of reaching out to, I know that there have been contamination sites and, class action lawsuits in Alabama, so there might be some folks there, but that, that there might be some response from government. If not, right, there are a couple of labs where you can do, your own groundwater well testing yourself, or, paying for it out of pocket, which is pretty ridiculous to have to do that, but just to get that peace of mind. And then as far, I'd forgotten your third question there too.
I just said, how do we know, our water does or does not have this in it? And how do we go about, locating whether it does or not? So that's the main concern. It's just, it feels like it's been under tested for. The limits are way too high. You know what I mean? And, we're so closely located to Pensacola, and Pensacola has its issues, well-known issues with, PFOAs. So.
And then, David, did you want to talk about the groundwater, the tap testing thing that I'm not remembering the name of that EWG has?
Right. We have a tap water database that includes the public testing, where you can enter your zip code and click on your utility, and it will pull up whether or not there's public testing results, and so those would include all the tests done by EPA also. As you know, smaller utilities, or if you're on well water, that information isn't necessarily going to be there. So it's not comprehensive, but at least for places on bigger utilities, we'll give you an indication if these contaminants were found at higher concentrations.
Okay, so these chemicals are listed on that website, or if your water system.
So this is the this is a website, ewg.org/tapwater, and it includes all of the legally mandated tap water testing, as well as all of the EPA testing for the PFAS contaminants that took place in 2014 and 2015. So it's the most comprehensive data set that we could compile. But as we said, we think it's inadequate for the PFAS contamination, but it does give you some indication if there's the higher levels.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
We are just about out of time. We're actually a little bit over. I did want to give our speakers an opportunity to make any final remarks, and then if there are people who have burning questions and we didn't get to you, you could go ahead and email me your question, and I can try to direct it to the appropriate person who could help. So Pam, Shana, and David, would you like to make any final remarks before I close out the call?
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. And again, if folks are concerned that their water could be contaminated, want to get testing for your community, join the coalition, get in touch. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is David. Thank you again for putting together this very, very interesting conversation. And I'm more than happy to answer any additional follow-up questions that may be sent in to you. I know this is really just scratched the surface in terms of really diving into this issue.
Wonderful, thank you. And Pam, did you want to say anything else?
Just briefly, I want to thank Shana for organizing a call of the National PFAS Contamination Coalition this afternoon, and we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about international actions to ban some of these PFAS substances, and so I'll be speaking about that later today.
Great, and I want to let everyone know that this call was recorded, and I will be sending a link to the recording so that if you want to share it with other colleagues or friends or access it later, then you can do that. And also I will include as many resources as I can to learn more about this important topic. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. If you have additional questions, you can call 907-222-7714 or email me at diana@akaction.org. And please consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics in support of our monthly Che Alaska calls. Your contribution makes a real difference. You can give online at akaction.org. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful day.